Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Dark Souls 3 Dissected. Today we're going to be examining the world layout of Lothric. This game does a great job of teasing upcoming locations and letting you look back at places you were previously. But unless you've examined it all carefully, it might not always be obvious what you're looking at exactly. And even if you do recognize a location, how can you be sure if it's accurate? Do these distant views have any spatial accuracy, or is it all just smoke and mirrors? So the purpose of today's episode is to help untangle any possible mysteries of the world's design, and to help clarify how everything fits together. Join me in exploring the looming landmarks of Lothric. You can skip to the timestamp on the screen if you'd like to get straight into the analysis, but this is another topic that I'd like to preface with a bit of context. After doing an episode on Lordran's layout for Dark Souls 1, I got a lot of requests to do the same for its sequels, but also some skepticism that there'd even be anything to talk about. Dark Souls 1 is a quasi-Metroidvania with a lot of interconnectivity between areas, so clarifying the world's structure helped reveal how they pulled that off. With the sequels either switching to having flagrant violations of spatial accuracy, or just becoming a lot more linear, did the sequels even warrant the same kind of analysis? I think today's episode will make it abundantly clear that the answer is yes, there's still quite a lot to talk about. Just because the sequels didn't go for the exact same thing, doesn't mean that there aren't interesting things to learn about each world. And in the case of Dark Souls 3, I'm going to have a lot of positive things to say. Now, I am among the group of people who strongly prefer the maze-like interconnectivity of Dark Souls 1, but the more I examine Dark Souls 3, the more I appreciate what they did. So regardless if you're someone who wholeheartedly loves Dark Souls 3, or if you're someone who prefers another game in the series, I think you'll be interested in seeing some of the care and effort that went into constructing the game's layout. Let's just go straight to the high wall of Lothric. As soon as we enter the level, even before we set foot outside the starting room, 6 distant levels are rendered. Enabling FreeCam to look outside the room helps reveal that they're already here on display. And this is only counting distant levels outside of the Lothric Castle area. If we want to include the different levels within the castle, that number increases to 9 or so locations total, depending on how you divide everything up. Now, normally you can't see any of this from inside the starting room, but it's just a matter of stepping outside and looking over the nearest wall to the right. So Dark Souls 3 may have shied away from being as non-linear and interconnected as Dark Souls 1, but to perhaps compensate for this, and the sometimes iffy area transitions of Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3 decided to go all in on telegraphing distant locations to the player. Showing this many areas at once isn't something that happens by accident. In fact, they essentially doubled the amount of distant areas that can be seen from a single level, compared to anywhere from Dark Souls 1. So the central gimmick to Dark Souls 3 is being able to look ahead or look back at other areas, and it's pretty impressive how much effort went into this. But to what extent does any of this make sense? The routes to distant areas are usually more circuitous than traditional open-world games, and the game usually isn't rendering the actual levels from a distance. From here, none of these distant levels are loaded in any way. Instead, we have low poly and simplified renditions of them that belong to the map that we're currently in. This means that these set pieces could have been placed literally anywhere with zero regard to the actual levels locations, since they're merely props. Let's start with the broken bridge leading into the Undead Settlement. We're taken there via cutscene, where Batwing demons fly us there, so there's no reason to assume that it has to be placed with any kind of accuracy. One thing we can do to verify its placement is to drop prism stones along the bridge. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't work too well, because using a bonfire or homeward bone to warp back up to the high wall of Lothric would put us through a loading screen and the prism stones would go away. But I suppose that, because of how the Batwing demons carried us here, there's a transition between the two areas that causes Lothric to be in a loading queue, where it can load from here without really needing to sit through a loading screen. It's essentially in a semi-loaded state, which is how the game readies neighboring maps so they can load seamlessly. The game might not be rendering anything from the high wall at this moment, but setting foot on any collision from it will force the game to update, fully loading the high wall properly without losing the prism stones I dropped. So from here I can just teleport directly to the coordinates of the high wall bonfire, and it should work just fine. At first glance, it looks worrisome. The prism stones are nowhere in sight. But if we look closer, we can see that they're buried ever so slightly beneath the surface, and that the end of the bridge and the entrance to the undead settlement are exactly where they should be as well. So this distant view is actually very accurate, ignoring the fact that we can't see the segment with the steps that we walk down. Now how does it handle something further off into the undead settlement? We can do the same trick with the stairs leading towards the curse-routed Greatwood, and once again we find things lining up very nicely, just a few feet off from where they should really be. So yeah, it's pretty impressive that they made this distant view as accurate as they did when they didn't really need to. This isn't the only vantage point of the broken bridge. We can get a much closer look when we're ready to trigger that cutscene from the exit behind Vort. This view has much more detail, and now that the undead settlement is in that semi-loaded state again, we can toggle its navigation meshes into view. Nav meshes blanket traversable parts of the map. It's what tells the game where enemies can go, so their AI can chart a path along those segments to determine how to get to you. Since it's overlaid with the actual level geometry, we expect it to align if this view is accurate, and it won't be aligned if it's inaccurate. Lo and behold, it's very accurate. We can see a lot of details line up perfectly, like this bridge, the top of the tower with the giant, and the entrance to the Road of Sacrifices. There are some details and elements missing from this simplified version, and a few things get a little misaligned, but when it comes down to it, when we look at the undead settlement from here, we know that it's actually there, and we're starting off with a pretty strict adherence to spatial accuracy. Now, do note that we don't see any nav meshes for the opposite side of the broken bridge. That's because that counts as part of the Fair and Keep, which I'll talk about later. So let's continue through these areas in order. We just saw that the entrance to the Road of Sacrifices lined up well from the nav meshes, and using prism stones again helps reinforce that. Though the representation of the entire area itself leaves a bit to be desired. They went with an ultra-simplified rendition, so there's not much that's recognizable here. Being a fairly simple earthen area, without a lot of distinct landmarks, it's understandable that they didn't worry about it quite as much. But what's that supposed to convey? Moving into the actual level of the undead settlement gives us a closer, yet still distant view. We can see things have changed for this perspective. The entrance itself is still where it should be, but the earth is a bit different now, starting to reflect the level a little bit better. We can recognize some things like the path that descends into the level, and there's also the tunnel cave, and that underhanging path. The prism stones reveal that it's a little misaligned, but the general idea is still there. Here's where things start getting a bit more relaxed. We can't see anything that clearly resembles the entrance area where we meet Horse and Henri, but we do see this building. Laying prism stones across the bridge makes it pretty clear it's meant to represent the entrance structure seen here. It's a bit lower here than it should be. I want to say that this is probably the result of wanting to start exaggerating distances more, to start disguising how compact the overall game really is, but this building is also rotated in the wrong direction. The entrance should be on this side, but they put it down on this side. They probably weren't expecting us to look this closely. Okay, so we have the path descending into the level, the cave tunnel, the cliff underhang, and a building that vaguely resembles the entrance to the halfway fortress bonfire with Horus and Henri. Beyond that, the detail mostly ceases to exist for the watery area with the crabs, which should be down here. This taller building on the right does line up with this structure though, which is pretty neat. Then we can see some more familiar stuff again further back. On the right we have the entrance to the Fair and Keep, guarded by those two NPCs. Don't mind me, just dropping some prison stones here. So yeah, it's kind of neat we can see this from up by the entrance of the undead settlement. It lines up pretty well. Once again, the actual prism stones are hidden just underneath the low poly version of the map. On the left, we can see a patch of earth that sticks out. This would be where we find the Crucifixion Woods bonfire. Behind them are the buildings that lead to the Crystal Sage. They're pretty detailed. We can recognize this as the building on the left, and going over a small bridge takes us into the building where we meet Orbeck of Vinheim. Here I've encircled the area containing the Crucifixion Woods bonfire, as well as the bonfire itself. This helps reveal that the perspective is a bit off, but it's in the right ballpark still. What's not in the right ballpark at all, however, is the Cathedral of the Deep. You'll notice that the map just kind of disappears behind these buildings leading to the Crystal Sage. And this to me is one of the biggest flaws in how the world layout is conveyed. The cathedral should be located on a hill behind the Crystal Sage. If we go back up to Lothric, we can see the cathedral again, more or less where it's supposed to be. Swinging the camera around to the left reveals the rooftop side entrance that we have to take to get inside. Another comparison shows that it's once again in the right ballpark, where the building was pushed maybe 50 feet or so back from its actual location. So if we can see it just fine from Lothric, what happened to it from the Undead Settlement's perspective? Instead of being back there, it got moved all the way over here to the left. Now, when we first step out from by the bonfire here, we see the building that leads into the Road of Sacrifices, and we can also see the cathedral. Perhaps it was moved here for artistic reasons, so we can see both things at the same time. It seems like a possible explanation, but it comes at the cost of just having the map kind of awkwardly dead-end from this vantage point where it shouldn't have. Now, occasionally, Dark Souls 3 represents some of the distant views with object files instead of actual map data. What I mean is that most of what you see in the environment is all just map. If you disable it from rendering, basically everything will disappear, aside from enemies and objects like doors and boxes. So making big chunks of the environment an object file, like a door or box, isn't super common, but it happens from time to time in this game, and this is one of those times. The cathedral is one big object file, but only from this vantage point. From others, it's just part of the map again. I'm not sure there's really anything to take away from this, other than the fact that this one time where its placement is drastically off happens to be the one time they chose to render it as a completely different kind of asset. I wondered if maybe they moved it closer to the Giant's Tower on purpose, because you might remember that there's also a spot outside the cathedral that he also rains his arrows upon. And so from up here, maybe they wanted to make it seem closer than it really was. But I don't know if that's a great explanation. If we go down to that area, the relationship to the tower is represented accurately from down here. The Giant's Tower really is right over there. Even the giant is rendered from here. And looking back at the cathedral, there's no obvious reason they wouldn't have wanted to place it where it belongs from the perspective of the Undead Settlement. It would have looked fine over here. Okay, now we're at the last stop on this particular part of our journey, the Farron Keep. You know the drill by now with the Prism Stones, so I'm not going to bother showing myself dropping them, but I've marked the 3 towers of flame that need snuffed out in order to gain access to the Abyss Watchers. I was curious if they haphazardly dropped these in here, because the swamp is disorienting, and I probably wouldn't have noticed if anything was amiss. The exact placement is misaligned a bit, but they aren't placed randomly. The towers are still aligned and spaced correctly with regards to each other. And here's a look at the building containing the Abyss Watchers. I marked the forking paths leading up to the door. From the perspective of the Undead Settlement, we can see that the one path going down a hill is aligned pretty closely to a low poly version of that hill. We don't see much of the other forking path nearby, but it should lead into the end of that wall area here. Going just a little underneath the surface reveals that path was pretty closely aligned to that as well. Following the Prism Stones up, I was surprised to see that I even managed to keep Black Hand Gotthard's summoning sign loaded into the game from here. And now, back from Lothric Castle, we can see that they actually raised the distant view and moved it a little closer to make it easier to see, when the actual level space is a bit lower and further back. What's more interesting to me is the far side of the broken bridge. We can see that it's represented fairly accurately from both sides. And our view down below to the Farron Keep and Road of Sacrifices is much more detailed than before. This isn't much of a surprise given that we're still technically in the Farron Keep's map, and it's all just one big level that's inclusive to the Road of Sacrifices. The incentive to keep the assets where they're actually meant to be is much greater now, and this is precisely what happened. When we look at how the Road of Sacrifices is portrayed, we can see the inclusion of the bridges now, and dropping prism stones along the paths shows that everything is finally exactly where it should be. The Cathedral of the Deep is now very close to precisely where it should be as well. Some of the path between the Crystal Sage and the Cathedral isn't portrayed from here, like the area with the fire and the bridge. But most of the rest of it is roughly there in low poly form. The part here that's most fascinating to me is that, back from the Undead Settlement side of the bridge, we can see items from the other side that belong to the Farron Keep's map. But the Farron Keep isn't loaded from here. We're simply looking at a duplicate of the far side. So what are objects that belong to a different level doing here? This isn't a situation like before, where I could teleport up to the High Wall of Lothric. Farron Keep is too far from here and isn't queued to load, so going over there with gravity disabled doesn't force the actual level to load. But I can still pick up the objects, and they're somehow accurate to what's really there. And upon closer inspection, the corpses from both sides don't match up perfectly, and even the corpses are in different poses. So there's two different sets of corpses, and they both contain the same items. But picking up the items from one location will make it disappear from the other location, so you can't actually get them twice. It turns out that they had two different sets of corpses that share the same lot item ID, so it's pulling from the same event, essentially, even though they technically appear on different corpses at slightly different locations, depending on which level you're in. I find this really interesting because I think this might be a unique occurrence in the Soulsborne games. Most of the time, if we see an item that's far away, it's still technically in the same level. Even the lore and dungeons in Bloodborne could show items that are currently on a different layer, but you're still just inside one big map in that situation. In the case of Dark Souls 3, it's not just one big map, so those items shouldn't have been visible at all, yet they purposefully went out of their way to create a rough facsimile for us. This was not at all necessary, but I think they wanted to signal to us that we will be able to get over there later. Being teased with items to let us know they're there is nothing new for the series, but this might require the longest journey to actually get there, and so they had to invoke an unusual technique to show it to us. This says to me that the developers really thought and cared about the game's layout. So there's a bunch more views and area relationships to cover, but I would like to point out some mistakes or inconsistencies in the areas we've seen so far. Ones that go beyond simply being misaligned a bit. Though I do want to clarify that I think these are mostly just interesting oddities, and pointing them out isn't really intended to be like a list of criticisms. In a later segment I'll be talking about how good of a job I think Dark Souls 3 does at hiding its spatial inaccuracies. Really, the only issue I have so far is with how the cathedral is significantly misplaced when seen from the Undead Settlement. Everything else has been pretty good so far. These upcoming things are also maybe not so good, but they don't bother me in the same way. They're very hard to notice, and don't really break the illusion of the game's space unless you start digging deep. Let's start with the bridge that takes us into the Undead Settlement. From the point where it's broken, you can see that it's basically just one more segment of bridge, with regards to the towers extending above, and the support columns underneath. Beyond that, it dead ends immediately into a cliff. And so we can see that there's quite a bit of space between it and the building that leads into the Road of Sacrifices. Well, if you've ever looked up at the bridge from below, you might have noticed that this isn't always conveyed correctly. From the first bonfire down here, you can look up and see some bridge nearby, above. We shouldn't see that at all, instead it should have dead-ended right here, instead of crossing all the way through the Undead Settlement. Most of the area below does a pretty good job of making this hard to see, but you can get a pretty decent look at it from inside that cave tunnel area. None of that should be in sight. So yeah, I suppose whenever you do get a clear look back at it, you're not supposed to think about it too much. It starts being portrayed correctly again when we descend below to the Farron Keep, and when we reach the cathedral. So it's just kind of the Road of Sacrifices that messes it up. Earlier when I mentioned the lack of detail when looking down into the area with the crabs, I glossed over the fact that there's another structure seen down there. As you may recall, there aren't any buildings or ruins in the middle of that watery area, so it really shouldn't be there at all. Circling a tree with prism stones down there shows where it lines up, and there's just nothing nearby that it could be intended to represent. And so I wasn't surprised to see that it disappears completely from the more accurate view that's seen from the Farron Keep's side of the bridge. But it does appear once again in the view from the Cathedral of the Deep, It's pretty much entirely hidden by trees, but it is there again. Something I wanted to praise Dark Souls 3 for, something it very nearly got right, which I thought was pretty cool, was how snuffing out the flames in the Farron Keep will show the corresponding pillars unlit when seen from above. This is by no means a complicated technical achievement, but I still appreciate it because distant views are pretty much never affected by your progress in any of these games. You may remember that in Dark Souls 1, this distant view of the demon ruins failed to drain the lava after defeating Ceaseless Discharge. So here it feels like they improved upon a missed opportunity from Dark Souls 1, until you go back up to Lothric and realize that that view no longer accounts for it correctly, and the flames just stay lit. But that's not the only issue here. It does get weirder. Something else we can see from the Undead Settlement is a fourth flame below. It doesn't have the same entire structure underneath it as the rest of the flames, but it's still the same flame effect attached to the same kind of pillar. Special thanks to Jack McClure for pointing this out to me. We can see that it should be roughly straight ahead from where the Abyss Watcher's fight occurs, and also directly below the broken segment of bridge, but an examination of the actual level shows nothing anywhere near there. I managed to find an unused cutscene for extinguishing this fourth flame. Okay, this animation for opening the door takes a really long time, so you're not going to miss much while I show a couple other things. While I was in the middle of editing this video, Zuli the Witch coincidentally made a post about this additional flame and brought something to my attention that I had overlooked. There's concept art showing a fourth relief for Seath. As it is now in-game, there are only 3 flames corresponding to 3 of the Lord Soul locations from Dark Souls 1. And Twitter user The Gutter pointed out that an unused texture for Seath's Shrine still exists in-game. Here, he modded it back in. So this unused fourth flame was meant for this. This is only seen from the Undead Settlement. Distant views from the Lothric Castle area only have 3 flame pillars in here again. But the distant view from Lothric does have more stuff in it that we can't see from anywhere else. Further beyond the walls of the swamp, we can see another segment of wall and also more ruins that look a lot like the ones that hold the flames. Now, I'm kind of 50-50 on whether or not this is a mistake. Who's to say there can't be more ruins out there? We can't see them from the Undead Settlement, but it is pretty foggy down there, and the Undead Settlement kind of forfeits its right to be any kind of authority on distant views, dead-ending the map here when it shouldn't have. So yeah, for now we can pretend they're hiding in the fog. That works well enough for me. When you're closer to that area, there's not really anywhere you can get a better look over the wall, so nothing is rendered out there. This view from the Cathedral of the Deep puts some ground and trees out there again. There's no ruins still, but it's just unclear enough to not feel disharmonious with the view from Lothric. However, the higher quality view from the Farron Keep side of the bridge once again shows nothing at all back there. But there's also other weird duplicates to be found from up here. There's 4 more Undead Settlements. One of them is in plain sight. If you think about the level layout, you might recall that the Undead Settlement should be entirely to the left of the building that leads into the Road of Sacrifices. So this is really just the Undead Settlement here. This means that what we see further back and to the right is just a duplicate. It's mostly familiar. You'll find the bridge leading to the stable, and also the bridge leading to the area above the cliff underside bonfire. But it's also a little bit different, where instead of having a familiar-looking building for where the curse-rotted Greatwood should be, there's a taller temple of some sort. And this area actually duplicates the whole thing. A bit further to the left you'll find the same bridges, the same opening for the cliff underside bonfire, and the same temple. So there's already a second extra Undead Settlement right beside itself here. If we consider the original view, it certainly looks intentional. It helps make the area look larger and more imposing, so filling out the landscape in this way was definitely an artistic decision. But it doesn't hold up under closer scrutiny since it's not represented from any other perspective. This view makes it clear that we should be able to see the extra settlement easily from the Giant's Tower. But from up here, there's nothing actually back there. I think with extra time and resources, they probably would have included it from this perspective. But the low poly version probably didn't look good enough from this close up, and if they used a higher quality version that matched the actual level, it might have more obviously been a copy and paste, which would have been weird to see. There's already a kind of rough-looking version of the Cathedral of the Deep nearby, so they likely had to draw a line and couldn't spend more time polishing these distant views. But here's where it gets even weirder. We have those third and fourth copies of the Undead Settlement further out. You can barely see one of them way off in the distance, just kind of some of the landmass surrounding it. It makes you wonder what the point was. And then we have this other one behind these mountain peaks, which is better lit and starts to feel a bit more purposeful again. I think all this extra stuff is just meant to convey more to the land than we can actually travel to, much like the other burgs of Dark Souls 1. So let's continue to break down some more of the distant views we haven't covered yet. We can see Anor Londo from the very start as well. I felt that Dark Souls 3 might have been a little heavy-handed at times, with callbacks to previous titles, but I really appreciate how Anor Londo was incorporated. They hinted at its existence from the beginning. They purposefully obscured it with a layer of clouds to make sure we didn't have any dead giveaways in sight, like the large rotating bridge. But each time you get closer, the architecture becomes just a little bit clearer. We can see a little more of it when we get to the platform behind Vort, and even more when we get to the Undead Settlement. It's a reveal that's hiding in plain sight, and once you discover that it's there, you're hit with the realization that you've already been seeing it from a distance this whole time. The execution of this was really good, and I've got to hand it to the developers. But where is Anor Londo, actually? Marking the steps leading up to the main door, we find that the true level is quite a lot higher than the distant view from Lothric. And the view from the Undead Settlement also pushes it further back. So it's in the right general direction, but the distances are pretty greatly exaggerated. Dark Souls 1 did something very similar with Anor Londo as it was seen from the Duke's archives. It really wasn't that far below there, either. Turning around reveals that we're pretty much level with the Undead Settlement, and it's really not that far from us. If the proximity here surprises you, I'll throw out another weird spatial violation while we're at it. If we drop a bunch of prism stones in this pit area in the Undead Settlement, they'll be visible in the sky above the profaned capital. Those areas seem like they should be pretty distant as well, but I think I can make both of these make better sense at the same time. But firstly, I should probably clarify how I see these kinds of distortions of the game space. I don't see all of them as flaws or mistakes, far from it. The idea that the space of a video game needs to maintain perfect consistency would be really weird and unfair. That's hardly a reasonable expectation. I don't think fans of other series pick apart the maps nearly as much as the Dark Souls community does, but I do understand how we got here. Dark Souls 1 set a high bar by surprising us with a ton of interconnected areas that fit together pretty decently. Dark Souls 2 disappointed a lot of people by not achieving that, instead having a lot of overlapping maps that didn't connect in a logical way with what the environment conveyed. But to boil the discussion down to Dark Souls 1 was good because it was accurate, and Dark Souls 2 was bad because it was inaccurate, is not, in my opinion, a valid way of looking at it. Dark Souls 1 cheated in a whole bunch of places. It's not that the world layout was perfectly consistent and that everything always made sense, it's just that its violations were more infrequent and harder to spot. So let's take this back to Dark Souls 3. Mostly all of the distant views so far have been reasonably accurate, aside from that one, but now we're making a bigger leap into having distances exaggerated even more, and having more parts of the map overlap. Is this where the illusion starts to crumble? Is this where Dark Souls 3 starts to get careless? I don't see it that way at all, and it makes me appreciate its sleight of hand. This is going to make for a very crude analogy, but I'm going to liken it to a hidden edit in a film which is portrayed as one long take. And where this hidden edit takes place in Dark Souls 3 is the catacombs. It's easy to step out of the catacombs feeling like you've descended further below. By the time you reach Irithyll, it looks like the rest of the world is pretty high up above you, and you might not think much of it. But if you stop to think about it, how far did you really descend? We descend those steps after the Abyss Watchers, and we approach this really big, cavernous room. It's a bottomless pit, and it certainly feels deep. And I suppose this is kind of a big drop, But if we stop to look at it, it's really not that much taller than some of the long ladders we've climbed in Lothric. And the level is mostly flat after this. Yeah, so we descend one more short staircase later in the level, and we also go through a cave that has like a slight downward slope. But by the time we ascend up into Wolner's room, we're actually higher than when we descended that short staircase. To put this into perspective, here's a side view of the prism stones I dropped at the beginning of the level. So we know the fight with the Abyss Watchers in the Farron Keep is aligned with the top of this staircase here. Pay attention to how little we descend as we approach the entrance to Irithyll. This transition sets up this latter chunk of the game to be a lot more compact with the rest of the game space than you might expect. Remember the prism stones in the Undead Settlement that we could see above the Profane Capital? We can also see them outside the entrance to Irithyll. This building up top is meant to be the one where we encounter the curse-rotted Greatwood, but they push the perspective of the Undead Settlement much higher and further back than it actually is. Using Dark Souls Map Studio, I've loaded both maps at the same time, and we can see the real building on the cliff below, and how it's placed compared to the fake distant version behind and above it. Let's also take a look at the Archdragon Peak. We can see this from the very beginning of the game too, which is pretty cool. It's just barely visible behind some clouds. Now, this is one perspective that we can't verify. There's not much to validate because, just like the Painted World or Undead Asylum of Dark Souls 1, these are maps that you warp to. The actual level space of the Archdragon Peak overlaps with Lothric Castle, which of course says nothing of its canonical, in-lore placement, or whatever you want to call it. But if you want to see that for yourself, you can lose your bloodstain on the bridge where we fight the Dragon Slayer armor, and then you'll find it floating in the sky of the Archdragon Peak. Just as a quick aside, I use bloodstains a lot in Lordran's layout to help line up locations, but for this video I've switched to almost entirely prism stones. The reason for this is that bloodstains don't appear from super far away in Dark Souls 3. The camera has to be within a certain distance or it'll go away. This is easy to see with FreeCam enabled. Now it's gone, and now it's back again. We can look out from the Archdragon Peak and see Anor Londo and Lothric in the distance. This time they're simply represented with 2D textures in the skybox. You might not think there's much to assess in terms of distance and placement for a 2D texture, but there's actually something pretty cool which shows how some of the environment was planned around this. The thing with skybox textures is that it's not uncommon for them to loop. Instead of having to create a single texture that will wrap around your environment for a full 360 degrees, you could make maybe one that covers only half of it and then repeat it. But it's easier to get away with it if you have some generic sky and clouds or whatever. It's not so easy to get away with if you have obvious landmarks in your skybox that aren't supposed to repeat. And it would certainly look bad if there was a second Anor Londo and second Lothric that weren't supposed to be there, right? But I just had this gut feeling that if I turned around 180 degrees and looked for it, I would find some illegitimate duplicates. And as strange as it is to actually see it, I can't say it surprised me at all. What I find cool about this is that they made sure we couldn't see them by blocking our view with a couple large mountains. And they also carefully considered the size and placement of these mountains, because they didn't make them any bigger than they needed to. They could have made them super massive and not cut things too close, but if we go out to the furthest vantage point to maximize parallax, a teeny, tiny sliver of Anor Londo would come into view if it weren't for some extra cloud coverage. So these might look like some random mountains out here, but it's all built with delivering this exact viewing angle for us. And the distant views of the Archdragon Peak hold up reasonably well. It's not just totally generic bridges and towers that vaguely resemble the design of the level. The specific landmarks are true to the actual level, and they still made sure to show us the correct side and general angle. There are some differences like the bridge being broken from this vantage point, but otherwise it's pretty accurate. Here's the view from Anor Londo where we can see it more clearly. This time the bridge is intact. I also wondered if the view from Irithyll Dungeon made any sense, because it's pretty easy to lose your orientation by the time you're down here. I figured they could have gotten away with pointing this view in any direction, and thought they might be cheating here a little. But I used Dark Souls Map Studio to alternate loading the maps for Anor Londo and Irithyll Dungeon, and we can see that they share an identical placement for the Archdragon Peak. In other words, what you see from up here and what you see from down here are perfectly consistent with each other. Now, its placement is a bit off compared to the view way back from Lothric, but it's displaced in a similar way to how Anor Londo's placement gets adjusted after passing through the catacombs, so how it's being manipulated isn't without consideration either. Firelink Shrine has been entirely absent from this discussion so far, and that's because you can't see it from anywhere else in the distance. And you also can't see other locations from Firelink Shrine, aside from Lothric Castle, of course. There is a pretty simple reason for this, and it's because it's pretty much on the opposite side. Lothric Castle obscures Firelink from everything else. Now, it's no secret that the untended graves are the same location as Firelink Shrine. It's basically just Firelink at night, with some different enemies. But calling it a duplicate would be going too far. Instead, it's quite literally the exact same map, just with some different settings being applied. The same map pieces are being loaded at the same coordinates, which is why a bloodstain dropped in one version of it can be found at the exact same spot in the other version. This means we can use our entry into the Untended Graves to help inform us of Firelink's placement. Let's first start from the Consumed King's Garden. This is the path that takes us back to Firelink. So, roughly speaking, we just enter this building and then turn right. Now, where is the placement of this building? Going back to our view from the high wall of Lothric, it's basically just straight ahead and down here. So we see the garden behind and to the left of the church where we fight the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. And remember that this church is a complete 180 degrees opposite of where we encounter Vort, which is where we get that grandiose view of most of the rest of the game. So this is going to be kind of a rough fly-through because not everything will be rendered from here, but to help cement everyone's understanding of the layout, let's start with this view from here using FreeCam. We're going to turn around completely and head towards the Dancer. Then we're going to veer left just a little to wind up in the Consumed King's Garden. Then we would go through the building where we fight Oseros, and then veer right a bit to wind up in Firelink Shrine. The backside of Lothric Castle isn't rendered from this view, but you can see how it places mostly everything else on the opposite side of the castle, which is why it mostly makes sense that we can't see Firelink from anywhere else. But as you can see here, they did cut things pretty close. It's not like we wound up completely on the opposite side, it's more like we rounded the outer wall of Lothric until we were just out of view. This means that looking back from Firelink, just being able to peer a little bit around the side would have more of this stuff coming into view. This is going to look pretty visually noisy for a moment, but I've loaded both maps at the same time in Dark Souls Map Studio. Here's the top of the tower in Firelink, looking back towards the castle. You'll see how flying around to the left takes us to the backside of the broken bridge. And now here we are, approaching the entrance of the Undead Settlement. So in other words, Firelink Shrine is just a little bit out of view around this curved wall here. Now, because of how close they cut it, things are a little iffy in a few places. Looking back from the distant view of Anor Londo, the tower of Firelink Shrine is poking out back there. But from the perspective of the actual level of Anor Londo, that puts more of a hill blocking that vantage point, so it's not totally unaccounted for. It reminds me of how they blocked the skybox in the Archdragon Peak. It's like they wanted Firelink Shrine to be out of view, but they cut it really close. But it doesn't account for drastic differences in how the general environment is portrayed, which is something else they could have perhaps tidied up a bit. From the perspective of Lothric, you get a lot of green-looking terrain, and even the view of some lake in the distance. It's not until much further in the distance that you get all those larger, white mountains. From the perspective of Firelink, we can't see any of that. It's all just those mountains. So the hidden placement of Firelink from the rest of the game does generally make sense, but the skyboxes disagree a little on how the generic distant scenery is portrayed. I'd like to give a quick shout out to 2236 Gaming on YouTube. Several years ago, they made an entire video dedicated to unraveling the placement of Firelink Shrine. Though I did my own research and found the same thing, they didn't use any special tools like Debug or Map Studio, and managed to deduce pretty much the precise location of Firelink by simply comparing landmarks and sketching out a few things. I'll link to that if you'd like to give it a watch, and it's a testament to how a lot of these landmarks do roughly match up as they should, well enough to inform you of where Firelink really is. Speaking of these views, we might as well break down Lothric Castle itself while we're at it. Something I'd like to do is help break down how Lothric is conveyed and how accurate it is, or sometimes isn't. We'll start with some of the distant views before we break down its internal consistency. Looking back from the Undead Settlement, I can turn the nav meshes back on to show that most of it is where it should be. We don't immediately see anything for the platform behind Vort, but it does line up pretty well if you look just a little below the texture. Then for the high wall area, we can see that the actual level space matches very nicely with it. But what about the more distant structures that we can't see nav meshes for? We can see the building where we fight the Twin Princes, and that is almost exactly where it should be. I lined the main walkway with prism stones, and we can see that this view is pushed back ever so slightly from its actual location. I also lined that circular rooftop area above the Grand Cathedral, and we can see that it's a little more misaligned, but it's still in the right general area. This view of Lothric remains unchanged for all vantage points from before the catacombs, and as expected it shifts when we arrive in Erythil. Surprisingly, for the view from Erythil, they moved it a little closer. We can see that the actual level is a bit further back. That might seem odd when the goal should be to exaggerate distances from here, but they did move it quite a lot higher. This shows that for the developers, the more important visual effect was changing how much it towers over us from down here. Okay, so let's look closer at the interior of Lothric Castle. Of course, we can see several upcoming areas within the castle right from the start. Again, we have the cathedral where we fight the dancer. We can see the building where we encounter Oseros at the far end of the Consumed King's Garden. We have the Dragon Barracks, located above the Dancer's Cathedral. We have the bridge where we fight the Dragon Slayer armor. The exterior of the Grand Archives and the rounded rooftop it has on top. And the main walkway leading to the Twin Princes Tower. We can also see that the platform behind Vort is really close to where we start the level. I'm beating a dead horse with these prism stone comparisons by now, so I'm not going to compare every vantage point, but just know that these upper areas aren't 100% perfect with their placement. Instead, it's mostly just like the distant views of Lothric from the pre-catacombs areas, where they're pretty close to where they should be, but not always completely exact. I do think it's interesting to try and deconstruct the sort of visual noise of the level. If you're anything like me, it's easy to get lost in the scenery. For example, if you previously asked me to quickly identify the tower where we rescue Greyrat, I would have no idea which one that is exactly. I found it helpful to turn on the nav meshes. It helps distinguish the actual level from the parts that are purely visual. And Greyrat's tower, of course, is the one that has a descending staircase leading into it. The nav meshes help reveal that most of the level space of the high wall of Lothric matches the visuals, but there are a few places where it cheats. The dungeon that we descend to get to the Dark Wraith, where is that exactly? As it turns out, it's not represented from its exterior at all, and instead has unrelated stuff where it should be. The elevator shaft should be right here, and the bottom level with the Dark Wraith should be right there. It seems like they built this all without regard for that actual location, which is a reasonable concession. We can't expect everything to be perfect, but there is something here I find interesting. As you approach the tower that leads to that area, you'll happen to find one segment of wall that's taller than most other walls around here. I don't think this is a random choice at all. I believe they put it here purposefully to help obstruct our view. If they didn't, we would more easily see a walkway over there that doesn't make any sense. Now, you can still see a little bit of it if you go further back, or if you go above to where the second bonfire is, but those angles make it less obvious than this particular spot would, so they made an effort to make it harder to understand that there's some spatial incongruity. And I believe it paid off. I doubt practically anyone notices this, unless maybe they look really carefully and happen to notice a message in a weird place. Something we can do to demonstrate the difference is what happens when we first step inside the tower. Before we do, we have that patch of illogical scenery. Then the moment we step inside, it toggles that scenery off and displays the Dark Wraith's dungeon. With FreeCam, we can see a large sort of grey box that contains all of it. Things also get a bit weird with the Consumed King's Garden. Our first view from the level only included the building for Oseros. The earliest we can see another element of it is when we first reach that second bonfire. We can see the top of the building that houses the elevator shaft that descends into the garden. But enabling the nav mesh shows that it's actually set a bit further back. Usually when things get misaligned, it's to help exaggerate distances, but in this case they brought it closer. I wonder if they had this particular vantage point in mind, allowing us to see it better than if it was placed at its actual location. Or perhaps it was meant to give us a closer look when we first reach this area. But this is where the inconsistency reveals itself. We should be able to look back at this area and see the staircase that we're on. But when we get to the entrance of the actual level, the staircase isn't anywhere to be seen, and instead there's a completely new wall here. It should have just been the backside of this building. Though we can see that the developers still made some effort to hide this from us. The inclusion of trees from both perspectives helps obscure our view and steers our eyes away from it. What's interesting to me is that a distant view that reconciles both designs wasn't completely ignored. From up by the Dragon Slayer armor bridge, we can look down and see both the wall and the staircase further back. But yeah, this all means that if that wall was supposed to be in the middle, then we wouldn't actually have been able to see the consumed King's Garden at all from that staircase. Now, the biggest spatial violation in all of Lothric is found in the transition leading to the Dragon Barracks. It doesn't include this set of towers, and we can start to see why when we take a closer look. Looking down from the towers, we can see the entrance to the Dancer's Cathedral, but it's not actually that far down at all. They're exaggerating distances again here. Marking the pathway shows that it's significantly closer, meaning these towers are jutting out into the courtyard. And not just by a little bit, but to a pretty extreme degree. When we reach the top of the ladder, the game begins transitioning the maps in such a way where it hasn't gotten rid of the actual courtyard yet, but it has begun displaying those towers. So FreeCam will make it very obvious just how much the two maps overlap. This might look kind of sloppy, but it's another well-hidden transition in my opinion. Climbing up a ladder and going up some steps is just disorienting enough to not make this obvious. Just like the small descent through the catacombs, it's easy to be tricked about a distance traveled vertically. And because they're deceiving us about the distance here, it also means that other scenery gets similarly misaligned as well. And just one more distant view of Lothric to reconcile here. I was curious to see how the backside view from Firelink Shrine matches the game space. It's difficult to compare the nav meshes, since Firelink and Lothric don't typically load together. That is, until you start approaching from the consumed King's Garden. But then things turn to nighttime and we can't see very well. But if from Firelink Shrine we teleport up to the cave that we normally drop down from to enter the Untended Graves, I can force Lothric to load while keeping Firelink Shrine in daylight. So what I wanted to deconstruct is what parts of this view from Firelink is legitimate game space. As we can see here, there are some extra bits added on to make it appear wider and more massive. But even though we can't see it from Firelink really, they still kept a chunk here that represents the game space very accurately. If you're wondering what's real in this distant view, it's where the light grey architecture at the bottom stops and transitions to rock, where they've added a completely new section that isn't seen from any other vantage point and shouldn't really be there. Then the towers to the right aren't real traversable parts of the level either, but they are properly accounted for as out-of-bounds scenery that you do see when you're inside the actual level. Just look to the right when you're on the high wall, and you'll see them over there. The other piece of actual level we see here is the backside of the tower where we encounter the Twin Princes. The walkway leading into it would be completely on the opposite side from this vantage point, leading from this direction. Of course, we don't ever scale or traverse the backside of the tower, so there's not really any walkable map space here to compare. But I can still drop a bloodstain in the middle of the room, and see if it lines up with the view from Firelink. And we find the bloodstain pretty much dead center. I realize I said that was going to be the last distant view for Lothric, but I did want to talk about an underlying concept for the game's world. You can also see Lothric and Anor Londo from the end of the DLC, but there's not much to say about their placement. Again, being areas that you warp to, there's nothing to really say about the locations of the DLC. And as far as the actual game space is concerned, this distant view is so far off from Lothric's actual location that there's no point in even doing a comparison. Just know that it's nowhere near here. And also, Anor Londo's relationship to Lothric here is now totally different as well. But in terms of lore, it's stressed that the lands are converging, and while the Dread Heap shows us a very severe version of that, you do get a sense of that in the base game, with Anor Londo being positioned in such a way that the surrounding lands no longer resemble Dark Souls 1 at all. So lands are shifting to converge upon Lothric, and it helps explain Anor Londo, But does anything else convey this early on? Well, the broken path to the Undead Settlement is the game trying to show us exactly this, right after Vord. If you've ever wondered what this platform was supposed to be before it collapsed, it's supposed to be the broken bridge below. The item description for the small Lothric banner reads, "When the high wall appeared, the path to the Undead Settlement was blocked." If that sounds a little confusing, they're not saying that the high wall of Lothric, like the castle itself, suddenly appeared, but that the earth underneath it rose up and created a very tall cliffside wall underneath it. That's what they mean when they're talking about the high wall. We can see that some of those who were on pilgrimage to Lothric made it before things got detached, while others got left behind. So, with most of the distant views and area relationships covered, there's a few more details we can nitpick. I wanted to look at the third location the giant can fire upon. That's down by one particular tree in the Firelink swamp. When we consider the angle of approach here, does it make any sense? If we trace the origin of the arrow, we find that it's spawning into existence right over here, and it appears to be arching from a lower angle, as if someone is firing them at a steep angle from behind the large doors that lead towards the Abyss Watchers. However, we can see that the actual object file for the giant is loaded in again, and he's placed up where his tower really should be. Looking back down at the Firelink Keep, we can see that they sort of picked the least logical place in the swamp for him to be shooting at, with his view completely obstructed. If you wanted to strive for something a bit more plausible, I suppose the tree and the crab could have been moved closer to the entrance of the Firelink Keep, where the giant would still have line of sight. This also helps reveal that this view back from the entrance of the Firelink Keep doesn't render anything of the Undead Settlement in the distance when it should, or could have. Maybe including it would have had a negative impact on performance, though. The entrance to the catacombs has this shaft of light coming in, but FreeCam reveals how high the top of it is in relation to the building where we fight the Abyss Watchers. So there should be a landmass behind it that's taller than it. It's not accounted for from any other view, but considering how the catacombs is where the bigger spatial transition happens, we can explain that away for the same reason. Speaking of light shafts, there's also this light coming into the Abyss Watchers room. And, It looks like something got moved and they might have forgotten to realign it. We also have this opening seen from the profaned capital. What direction is that pointing in, and should we be able to see it from anywhere else? Well, of course, it's in a post-catacombs area, so we can't take the exact placement too literally, but loading in the Lothric Castle maps shows us that it's pointing out over in this direction. In other words, if it was below this mass of Earth somewhere, we'd have to fly out somewhere in this direction in order to see it. So it actually makes sense that it's not represented in any of the distant views, so they didn't make any mistakes there. But wait, it was out in this direction, which should hypothetically be in view from Firelink Shrine again. In the map viewer, we can see that it's almost in view, but it's just barely obfuscated by this sheet here. And the sheet in-game is a layer of clouds. So yeah, of course nothing distant is represented in the skybox from Firelink, but if you want to take the in-game space somewhat literally, we still wouldn't really be able to see it, with clouds once again just blocking things. So this does account for the sort of empty open sky we see from inside. I was wondering if we should have been looking back at another location, but this is fine. Well, mostly fine, if you ignore just how much the Smoldering Lake actually overlaps with Irithyll Dungeon and the Profane Capital. We have this one view of the entrance to Irithyll Dungeon from inside the Smoldering Lake, and it's pretty cool that they're trying to give us a visual connection between two distant late game areas that have nothing to do with any of the other distant views. But this is one spot where they didn't even try to get it in the right ballpark. I think they just relied on us being underground long enough to get disoriented, but it does show a pretty stark contrast to the effort that was put in for the rest of the map's orientations. We'll do another Prism Stone comparison here, lining the staircase to Irithyll Dungeon, and we find that it's not even in the right direction. We have to turn around, look back down into the Smoldering Lake towards the giant sandworm, and then we find the actual Irithyll Dungeon entrance nearby and out of bounds. I get that the distant view wouldn't work well with this view of the Smoldering Arch Trees or whatever they are, but if I could tweak the map's design, I would have plugged up this view entirely. Where we have this opening here, I would have shrunk the opening size and put the view towards Irithyll there. And if you still wanted a big open vista of Smoldering Arch Trees, I just would have had them lean more towards the left side of the level. And for the view from Irithyll, it would have been nice to at least have a small view into the smoldering lake from up here. To be perfectly fair though, the distant view of the Ash Lake Expanse from Tomb of the Giants in Dark Souls 1 didn't make any sense either, so maybe anything involving arch trees is where they're allowed to break the space the most. Oh yeah, I almost forgot, we arrived at this point of discussion starting back at the view from the Profane Capital. I said that it was mostly fine with regards to other distant views, but we did have to ignore these two maps overlapping. This is perhaps best visualized by dropping a bunch of prism stones by that massive horde of skeletons near the collapsing bridge. Let's take another quick look at the Dreg Heap. We can try to hunt down the sources for some of what we see here. In the skybox texture, we can see the undead settlement at the bottom, as well as what appears to be the kiln of the First Flame. We can also see some elements from Lothric, like the Dragon Slayer's bridge. In the playable environment, we have this great moment where we fall through a window and land inside what appears to be the ruins of the Grand Archives, which explains all the bookshelves. It appears to be a direct match of this set piece, aside from the fact that it was made much taller for the Dreg Heap. I find it strange that the building grew taller, but something else that reinforces the connection between the two locations is that you'll find an open nook here. This is where the ladder used to be. Anyways, finding some ruins of Lothric in the Dreg Heap feels a little dissonant with seeing it relatively intact in the distance later on. With more time, they probably would have meant for this to look a lot more ruinous. So I got some requests to compare the maps of the different games. The short version is that there's really not much to say about the world placement for something like Anor Londo. We can't look back and find any meaningful connections between where Sen's Fortress used to be, or where the Duke's Archives would have been. The lore itself makes it pretty clear the lands are converging, and so there's not a whole lot we can try to line up, because the surrounding landscape makes no attempt to sync up with Dark Souls 1. But that doesn't mean we can't consider some interesting aspects about how areas like Anor Londo, the original Firelink Shrine, and the Earthen Peak reappear in Dark Souls 3. But since that has less to do with the overall world layout, I think I'll save that for its own discussion in the future, not to mention prototype map content and some other weirdness. In the meantime, I highly recommend checking out Loki's lore analysis on Irithyll if you wanted something more to chew on regarding what happened between Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3. Overall, I think Dark Souls 3 made a lot of really smart choices with its world layout. Though the inclusion of bonfire warping from the start of every game since Dark Souls 1 has likely influenced a less interconnected design in the sequels, they still made a strong effort to consider the relationships between areas. In a way, it feels like they wanted to right some of the wrongs of Dark Souls 2, and they definitely accomplished that. Having your sort of main focal point be this castle that looms above, often staying in view while you explore nearby areas like villages and swamps, it also has a layout that would have been perfect for a 3D Castlevania. But I could go on and on about why the Souls formula would be the best fit for a new Castlevania game, so that might also be its own subject for a future discussion. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. I should give one final shout out to Lee Moria. They also did a bunch of examinations on the world layout, and I feel like they made one of the first thorough efforts on the subject. Though I did my own research independently, I found myself watching their videos partway through scripting this episode, and I was basically nodding in agreement with everything I saw. So those are some more videos I recommend watching if you dig this sort of thing. Also, a huge thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon. Any amount of support goes a long way to helping me make these videos. Backers at the Evil Vagrant tier include Alex the Bear, Astranicus, Curtis Ware, Gary Marshall, Harry Pham, Jamie Shermer, Carl Germ, Nashwana Zari, Pethris, the Majalis Duo, and Zelther. Thank you so much. Though I still have a bunch of specific episodes lined up that I've been meaning to do, the recent release of the Demon's Souls remake is inspiring me to research and cover some more topics from that game. So you can probably expect some more Demon's Souls Dissected in the near future. Until then, M'Basa. Praise the sun.